Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something deeply unsettling about a warrior who has forgotten how to feel pain, not the absence of it. That much we understand. Space Marines are engineered so far beyond the reach of ordinary suffering that pain, for them, is largely an informational input rather than an experience, a signal, a data point. But the Iron Hands are something else entirely. They looked at pain and decided that even the capacity for it was a design flaw, a structural weakness, a crack in the hull of a vessel that should, by rights, be constructed entirely of steel. And so they set about correcting the flaw, year by year, decade by decade, century upon silent century, with the patient dedication of engineers refining a prototype that will never quite reach perfection, but that they will never stop trying to bring closer to it. We're replacing the soft things, removing the parts that could bruise or ache or grieve, sealing the chambers of the self that might be entered by grief or fury or love, or the terrible, paralyzing human awareness of loss, until what remained was no longer something you could call simply a warrior, until what remained stood in the grey space between man and machine, wrapped in the cold gleam of augmented steel, speaking in voices processed through mechanical vocal synthesizers, looking out at the universe through bionic eyes that register light without warmth. Something harder, something older, something that walks through the ash-choked fires of the far future with the steady, unhurried, absolutely relentless rhythm of a machine that does not know how to stop, because nothing in its architecture has provision for stopping. Welcome back. You're watching Kyu on 40,000, and tonight we're stepping somewhere that doesn't have much warmth in it at all. Tonight we're following the long shadow of a dead Primarch across 10,000 years of iron and grief and cold calculation, down into the volcanic dark of a world that refuses to be tamed, into the humming quiet of surgical chambers where warriors remove their own limbs not because injury demands it, but because philosophy does. We're talking about the Iron Hands, one of the most original, most thematically rich, and most genuinely strange Space Marine chapters in all of Warhammer 40,000. A chapter that, 10 millennia on from its founding trauma, is still in the process of deciding what it actually is. A chapter whose story is, at its heart, a story about what happens when grief hardens into doctrine, was when loss calcifies into identity, when the machinery built to protect you from pain becomes the thing that makes you vulnerable to a different kind of pain entirely. Strange might be underselling all of it. What makes this channel the right place for a topic like the Iron Hands is the same thing that makes the Iron Hands themselves compelling once you slow down enough to really look at them. There's no dramatic spectacle here in the conventional sense. No volcanic eruptions of passion, no roaring battle cries, no warriors who love war with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of chapters that have found a way to make endless conflict feel like a calling rather than a sentence. The Iron Hands are quiet in the way that very old, very cold things are quiet. The kind of quiet that you can mistake for emptiness until you're close enough to realize that the silence is full of something. That something is 10,000 years of unresolved grief wearing the clothes of engineering. These are warriors who sever their own hands as a rite of initiation, not because they have to, because they want to, because the ritual gesture of offering up your own flesh and replacing it with cold metal is the most honest statement they know of what they believe and who they're choosing to become. These are warriors governed by a council of ancient veterans, entombed in towering mechanical sarcophagi, their organic bodies reduced over centuries to tiny remnants of biology housed inside walking war engines that have become more home than prison. Warriors whose chapter motto, "The flesh is weak," is not a metaphor, it's not a philosophical flourish, not a dramatic battle cry to be performed in the heat of close combat. It is a daily instruction, a structural principle, a design brief for the ongoing project of self-modification that each of them embodies. The project, in their view, is themselves, and every single thing about them, their culture, their hierarchy, their strange relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus, their particular hatreds, their particular blindnesses, their very specific and very profound character flaw. All of it traces back to a single killing field on a planet called Istvan V, to a day when 7 Space Marine legions were deployed to crush a rebellion, and 4 of those 7 turned on the other 3 and created one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the human species, to the day they lost their father, and what they told themselves about why. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because every story worth telling has a beginning, and the beginning of the Iron Hands is a world that makes Medusa sound like a paradise, which tells you something, given that the planet is actually named Medusa. So settle in. The dark is comfortable once you get used to it. Let's go back to the start. Part 1. Medusa, the world that never lets you rest. Imagine a planet that is actively trying to kill you, not in the passive way that space is trying to kill you, that ambient, impersonal hostility that all voidfarers learn to accept as the permanent background condition of their existence, not the way that a particularly hostile desert might kill you, through heat and thirst and the sheer indifference of an environment that was never configured with your survival in mind. No, imagine a world engaged in the effort with something approaching enthusiasm, a world that shifts and cracks and breaks and remakes itself on a geological timescale compressed so violently that you might watch a mountain range rise from a plain in the span of a single human lifetime, only to see it swallowed again by newly formed rifts before the century is out. That is Medusa, formerly designated Medusa 4, a planet in the segmentum obscurus that carries a reputation as one of the most inhospitable environments in the known Imperium, which is saying something in a galaxy that contains worlds where the oceans are liquid fire and the air itself is made of death. Yes, the segmentum obscurus already has a certain character to it, shaped in no small part by its proximity to the Eye of Terror, that vast, permanent wound in reality through which the forces of chaos pour in endless nightmarish streams. Medusa sits uncomfortably close to this neighborhood, positioned near the original location of what would become that tear in space, and the sky above the planet seems to carry some ambient awareness of this proximity. It is permanently dark, not in the romantic twilight sense of pleasantly dim lighting, but in the genuinely gloomy sense of a sky so choked with volcanic ash and industrial particulate that meaningful amounts of sunlight fail to penetrate it. Medusa lives in a perpetual murk, as though the planet itself is trying to hide. The geology is breathtaking in the most terrifying way possible. Tectonic plates shift beneath the surface with a frequency and violence that would classify the planet as geologically unstable to the point of being practically uninhabitable, if the people who live there hadn't been shaped over thousands of years to make habitation work anyway. Volcanoes are not scattered features of the landscape on Medusa. They are the landscape, dozens, hundreds, scattered across a surface that is constantly in motion, each one a reminder that the ground you're standing on is not a permanent feature, but a temporary arrangement that might be replaced by something considerably less solid before the day is done. Earthquakes accompany everything. Entire mountain ranges have been known to rise and then subside within a few generations of human memory. Seas drain into newly opened rifts. Some hot geysers punch upward through frozen tundra without warning or pattern. Coastlines move. The very shape of the world shifts and turns over in what feels, for those living through it, like a process that has no intention of ever stabilizing. And yet people live there, have always lived there, carved out an existence in the constant geological chaos with the specific stubbornness that comes from having no alternative. Because humanity is tenacious in ways that consistently catch the universe off guard. The people of Medusa are organized into clans, not cities. There are almost no permanent settlements on Medusa, because permanent settlement is simply too dangerous on a world where the ground can liquefy or collapse or be swallowed by a new volcanic vent at any moment. Not nations, not planetary governments, was not any of the administrative structures that more settled worlds rely on. Clans, mobile, nomadic groups of survivors who have built their entire civilization around the premise that survival requires movement and that anything you cannot carry with you is a liability. They travel on great land trains, enormous tracked vehicles, some of them substantial enough that entire communities live aboard them, moving continuously across the ever-shifting terrain in caravans that might stretch for kilometers. These machines are not comfortable. They have no luxury, no excess, no space or resource devoted to anything that cannot justify its existence in terms of function. They are exactly what the necessities of Medusan life require, and nothing more. Built by people who learned very early that anything surplus to survival is weight they cannot afford to carry. The clans compete. They have always competed, and the competition has always been real, with real stakes and real consequences for failure. Resources on Medusa are scarce in every meaningful category. Safe ground is scarce, potable water is scarce. The volcanic minerals that power the land trains require constant, dangerous extraction from unstable terrain. Food is limited to what can be grown in the brief and uncertain periods when volcanic activity subsides enough to permit it. So the clans raid each other's caravans. They contest the sparse areas of relative stability where temporary settlement might be possible. They fight over access to the mineral deposits that are also the most volcanically active regions. Because of course the things you need most are in the most dangerous places. There is no government, no central authority, no unified planetary council, no governor's palace from which some administrator manages the world's affairs in comfort. There is only the ongoing competition between clans, a competition that has, over uncountable generations, produced a people of extraordinary quality. Not quality in the gentle, cultivated sense, quality in the way a blade is quality, when it's been forged correctly and tempered right, sharp, resilient, reliable under the most extreme conditions, built for one purpose, and extraordinarily good at it. The land trains themselves deserve a moment of attention because they tell you something about how the Medusans think. Which are these enormous track machines, some of them so large that they constitute entire settlements in motion, carrying hundreds of people plus the equipment, food stores, mining machinery, forges, and medical facilities required for indefinite self-sufficiency, are maintained with the same religious devotion that other cultures reserve for their temples and holy sites. Because on Medusa, the land train is the temple. It is the thing that stands between the clan and the kill. The engineers and mechanics who keep these machines running are afforded the same respect that soldiers and warriors receive, sometimes more, because everyone on a land train understands the brutal arithmetic that governs their existence. The machine stops moving, the clan dies. And this produces a specific relationship with technology that differs meaningfully from the way most of humanity relates to its machines. Most people use tools. Medusans depend on them in the most elemental sense, the kind of dependence where failure of the machine is indistinguishable from death. A warrior on a land train who cannot fight is a liability. An engineer who cannot keep the drives turning is a catastrophe. And the distinction between fighting skill and mechanical skill, the division between the warrior and the artisan that cultures of relative comfort can afford to maintain, tends to dissolve on a world where the same person is frequently required to do both in the same afternoon. The clans also mine. Because the volcanic geology that makes Medusa so treacherous is also the reason its crust is extraordinarily rich in specific categories of mineral and metal, resources that the clans need to keep their land trains running and that the rest of the Imperium will pay generously to receive. Mining operations on Medusa are conducted in the most dangerous possible geological zones, because the richest deposits are invariably located in the areas of greatest tectonic activity. The irony that the thing they need most is found in the most dangerous places is not lost on the Medusans. They regard it as confirmation of a principle they already understood, that anything worth having requires you to go somewhere uncomfortable to get it. Inter-clan conflict, when it occurs, which is frequently enough to be a permanent feature of Medusan life rather than an occasional aberration, tends to be direct and decisive. The Medusans have no tradition of prolonged diplomatic maneuvering, of the kind of proxy conflict that more complex societies use to fight their wars, without quite admitting that's what they're doing. When two clans are in competition over a resource, or when one clan has done something that the other clan's code demands be answered, the resolution involves combat. Raids conducted with calculated efficiency, designed not just to hurt, but to impose specific costs and deliver specific messages. And on the other end of the conflict, when one side is beaten, the acknowledgement is direct and without performance. The beaten side adapts. The winning side does not gloat. Most because gloating is not a functional activity, and Medusans do not invest effort in things that don't function. Weakness is identified and addressed, rather than hidden or accommodated. This sounds simple and might even sound admirable, extracted from its context. Within the context of a world where identification of weakness is followed, sometimes immediately, by elimination of the individual who displayed it, it produces something that is harder to admire and easier to recognize as the direct ancestor of Iron Hand's philosophy. The chapter did not import a philosophy from outside. They inherited one from the world that made them, and then took it to conclusions that even Medusans, if you could ask them, might find extreme. Medusan children who cannot survive the conditions of their world simply do not survive it. But the ones who do carry something that is difficult to name precisely and easy to recognize in practice, it's not quite ferocity, though they have that. It's not quite stoicism, though they have that too, in enormous measure. It's something more fundamental, more structural. The settled, bone-deep certainty that weakness is not a condition to be accommodated or sympathized with or worked around. It is a condition to be corrected as quickly and as decisively as possible before it costs someone else their life. This is the culture into which the Primarch of the 10th Legion fell. The mountains that ring Medusa's northern waste still carry the scar of his arrival. The pod that brought him down was not designed for gentle landings. It struck the region around a peak called the Ice Pinnacle, with an impact that toppled that mountain and sent seismic waves rippling across the planet's surface for days afterward and reshaped the coastlines of several of the more geologically marginal regions. The infant who emerged from the wreckage would grow faster than any biological system could account for, faster than the Medusans could quite track, in the way of Primarchs who develop on accelerated timelines that seem to be written into their fundamental design. He would become, before long, the most significant being that world had ever produced, and the world would never be entirely sure what to do with him, so it mostly just tried to kill him and took note that it consistently failed. Part 2. Ferrus Manus, the smith who burned too hot. Every Primarch's story is shaped by the world they land on and what that world demands of them. Vulcan of the Salamanders was shaped by a world that required both strength and compassion, and he became both. Corax of the Raven Guard was shaped by a world of oppression and uprising, and he became the patron of those fighting impossible odds from the shadows. And Ferrus Manus was shaped by Medusa, shaped by its volcanic violence, its uncompromising standards, its absence of mercy for anything that could not justify its own existence. And he became the hardest, most demanding, most relentlessly self-improving of the Primarchs. Which is saying something, as a given that most of the Primarchs were already the most demanding beings in the known universe. His early years on Medusa are preserved in the planet's oral tradition, and in a text called The Canticle of Travels, which attempts to chronicle his wandering across the world before his reunion with the Emperor. The tales are almost certainly mythologized in the way that all ancient stories about extraordinary beings get mythologized, embellished in the telling. The proportions inflated to match the scale of the person they're describing. He challenged storm giants to tests of strength and won. He climbed every mountain, swam every sea, pushed himself through every extreme the planet had to offer, and returned victorious from each encounter. He also freed a horror on the world, which is perhaps the detail most essential to understanding him. Out in the forbidden region, called the Land of Shadows, a place shunned by the Medusan clans for reasons preserved in superstition rather than knowledge. The young Ferris discovered something ancient and dangerous, a chamber marked with runes, decorated with electroconductive formations that suggested an intelligence behind their design, sealed for reasons that probably should have been respected. His investigation triggered something inside the chamber. A creature was released, the being called Aseanoth, the Great Silver Worm, a colossal biomechanical serpentine entity that was impervious to virtually every form of damage available to anyone on Medusa at the time. What makes Ferris Ferris is that when this creature escaped and began its destructive path across the planet, he chased it, not with particular concern for self-preservation, and not with a carefully calculated tactical plan for dealing with an invulnerable opponent. He chased it with the absolute commitment of someone who had never seriously entertained the idea that he might fail to overcome something, because that possibility simply didn't feature in how he thought about the world. He chased Aseanoth to a volcanic region and killed it by drowning it in a river of molten rock. As the creature died, its substance, the living metal called necrodermis, the same material the ancient Necron machines are constructed from, melted against Ferris's arms in the heat of the volcanic flow, and as he pulled free from the cooling lava, it had fused to his flesh. Permanent coating of living silver metal, strong as ceramite and flexible as skin. His eyes went silver in the aftermath. He's suggesting the material had entered him more deeply than surface level, that whatever the necrodermis was, it had altered his physiology in ways that went beyond the obviously visible. Modern Imperial scholarship suspects that Aseanoth was a Necron guardian construct, a sentinel placed to protect a Necron tomb, or possibly the resting place of one of their star god entities, their Citan. If so, then the metal that fused to Ferris carried within it some quality of Necron technology, possibly something that touched his fundamental biological design in ways that never fully manifested, but may never have been entirely dormant. This is speculative. The Iron Hands do not particularly like to discuss it, which might itself be revealing. But the most famous element of Ferris Manus that doesn't involve either metallurgy or violence is his friendship with Fulgrim. On paper, they should not have been close. Ferris was a warrior smith of uncompromising practicality, a being who expressed himself most naturally through the creation of useful objects at the highest possible standard of quality, who regarded anything purely decorative with something approaching impatience. Fulgrim was the Primarch of the Emperor's Children, the Phoenician, a being devoted to beauty and sensory perfection, and the cultivation of aesthetic experience to its ultimate extremes. He was what you might call a maximalist, devoted to the full range and richness of human experience, as including all the emotions and pleasures and varieties of feeling that Ferris regarded with something between skepticism and suspicion. They became close anyway. The contrast seems to have been part of the point, each recognizing in the other something genuinely admirable, something they didn't have in themselves. Fulgrim called Ferris the Gorgon as an affectionate joke, a reference to the mythological Terran creature whose ugliness could turn men to stone. Ferris, with the surprising capacity for self-deprecating humor that his sons would later seem to lose entirely, apparently found this funnier than you might expect. The name stuck. By the time the Great Crusade was in full thunder across the galaxy, everyone called him the Gorgon. And the people of Medusa had incorporated him into their mythology as something between a deity and a geological event. He forged weapons for several of his brothers. His talent for metallurgy was extraordinary even among the Primarchs, who were themselves extraordinary in every measurable category. The sword he made for Fulgrim became a legend in its own right. A weapon of such beauty and quality that even Fulgrim, who demanded everything be perfect, couldn't fault it. He made a bolter for Vulcan of the Salamanders with a barrel designed to look like a dragon's open mouth, because Ferris understood that a weapon made for someone should reflect something true about them, that the best craftsmanship is craftsmanship that understands its recipient. He also had, although this would later become something his children seemed determined to forget, a quality that none of the mythology about cold, mechanical precision captures. He cared deeply about those he trusted. cared with an intensity that the iron exterior only partially concealed. When Fulgrim's ship came under desperate fire during the campaign against the alien Diasporex, a fleet-based civilization of perpetually mobile humans and Xenos that the Iron Hands and Emperor's children battled together, Ferrus turned his flagship around and went back for him, at real cost to his own legion's resources, because that was what you did when a brother was in trouble. He also had a particular quality with his own legion that the historical record captures in fragments. He knew their names, every warrior in the Iron Tenth, by the accounts that survive, and had been personally known to their Primarch in some capacity. He walked their training halls, he worked in their forges. He would arrive unexpectedly in a company's section of the ship and ask about a specific warrior's progress with a new augmentation, remembering details of conversations that had happened months earlier. For a being of his cognitive capability, this was not difficult, but the gesture of choosing to invest that capability in knowing his sons as individuals, rather than as a formation, conveyed something about what he actually valued. He built warriors who were hard because the galaxy required hardness, but he knew the people inside the hard exterior, and he did not believe that the people inside were a design flaw. This is, perhaps, what the Iron Hands lost that mattered most, not just a Primarch, not just a strategic command capability, not just the living embodiment of their identity and purpose. They lost the being who understood both dimensions of what they were, who could be as cold and mechanical and relentless as Medusan culture demanded, and who also knew each of them personally and cared about what he knew. Ferrus Manus was the integration that his legion has been attempting to rebuild through philosophy ever since he died. The Gorgon carried both things simultaneously. His sons are still trying to figure out how. Fulgrim, already infected by the influence of a chaos-touched blade he'd recovered from the alien world of Laren, reportedly could only interpret this act as self-aggrandizement. The warmth of the gesture was invisible to him through the lens of corruption. He saw calculation where there was affection, he saw competition where there was loyalty, and by the time the heresy began in earnest, Ferrus Manus's closest friend was already the instrument that would be used to destroy him. One more detail about Ferrus that matters here. He was reportedly uncomfortable with what his sons were doing to themselves, even during his own lifetime. The practice of cybernetic augmentation, replacing organic parts with mechanical ones, was already developing within the Legion during the Great Crusade, driven in part by the Legion's cultural inheritance from Medusa, and in part by the natural expression of their Primarch's relationship with technology. But Ferrus himself, by the accounts that survive, promised that once the Great Crusade was done, he would lay aside his own metal hands and work to end the practice. He wanted partnership with the machine. He should not surrender to it. He wanted his sons to understand that the strength he valued lived in them, not in the metal that would replace them piece by piece until the original was difficult to find. He never got to have that conversation. Part 3, the Iron Tenth, Crusade, Conquest, and the Shape of Legend. Before everything went catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, there was a time when the Iron Hands were simply excellent at the thing they were made to do. A time when the Gorgon walked at the head of his legion and the galaxy recoiled appropriately. The legion began under a different name, originally called the Stormwalkers, reflecting both the warlike culture of Old Albia on Terra, from which many of the earliest recruits were drawn, and the developing tactical doctrine that made them particularly effective at a specific style of battlefield dominance. They became the Iron Hands the moment Ferrus Manus was found on Medusa. Who else would his children be? The original name tells you something about who they were before he got to them. The name they took afterward tells you something about what finding their Primarch meant. The Stormwalkers were already impressive. The Iron Hands were, under the Gorgon's direction, something considerably more. Their role in the Great Crusade was specific, and they were remarkably good at it. Some legions were masters of rapid assault, elite shock troops who hit fast and hard and counted on momentum to carry them through. Others excelled at siege warfare, the relentless, grinding attrition of fortified positions where patience and heavy weapons were the decisive factors. Others still operated in the shadows, their victories written in the absence of any record of them having been there at all. The Iron Hands did what the Gorgon built them to do: high-intensity, combined arms warfare against enemies whose power and numbers made them dangerous over extended engagements. The tactical approach that built their early reputation was called the Hammer and the Storm, a doctrine elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. The Storm was the initial stage, vast numbers of Imperial army auxiliaries deploying en masse, making planetfall across a broad front, establishing footholds, pinning the enemy, absorbing the initial defensive response, and transforming it into an extended battle on terms the Iron Hands could dictate. The Hammer was what followed: the Legion's own heavy formations, its tanks and dreadnoughts and heavily armoured infantry, rolling through those established positions and into the enemy's line with the remorseless momentum of industrial machinery completing a task. Efficient, methodical, relentless. It was a way of fighting that guaranteed results given sufficient time, and the Iron Hands were patient enough to apply it correctly. The Iron Tenth, as they came to be known, became the formation you deployed when you needed an enemy comprehensively destroyed rather than merely beaten, when the victory needed to be permanent, but when the opposition needed to not just lose, but cease to be a meaningful factor in the campaign going forward. The Iron Tenth arrived and applied themselves until the problem was solved. The close relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus developed naturally from this combat style. Heavy war machines, dreadnoughts, armoured vehicles in the quantities the Hammer Doctrine demanded. All of these required Mechanicus expertise to maintain and supply, and the relationship grew from practical necessity into something that looked, over time, like genuine mutual recognition. The Mechanicus found in the Iron Hands a kindred spirit. Warriors who already spoke their philosophical language about the machine, who already looked at their own biological forms with the critical eye of engineers assessing a prototype. But warriors who didn't need to be persuaded that replacing organic components with mechanical ones was an improvement. They were already trying to figure out how to do it faster. The Legion also developed one of the more quietly fascinating battlefield specialties of the Great Crusade. They were extraordinary against technologically advanced enemies. Where some forces were best suited to quantity versus quality engagements, or to the kind of territorial warfare that favoured knowledge of the ground, the Iron Hands excelled against opponents whose power came from their machines. They could look at alien war technology with the systematic understanding of engineers who had spent their lives building and refining complex systems, identify the structural weaknesses, calculate the points of failure, and exploit them with a precision that more instinctive warriors couldn't replicate. They didn't just fight advanced technology, they understood it. And things you understand are much easier to destroy than things you're merely afraid of. Thousands of worlds fell to the Iron Tenth's relentless advance. Thousands of enemies encountered, assessed, and eliminated. The Gorgon drove his legion hard, harder than some of his brother Primarchs were comfortable watching. There are accounts of Ferrus Manus conducting war with an intensity that could tip from admirable to genuinely disturbing, depending on how much flesh was left on the floor at the end of it. But the results were undeniable. The 10th Legion broke enemies that other legions had struggled with. They held lines that should have broken. They sustained the pace of their advance through campaigns that ground down lesser formations because the Iron Hands, trained in the uncompromising school of Medusa, understood endurance as a competitive advantage. The campaign against the Diasporex stands as a particularly instructive case study in both the strengths and, with the benefit of hindsight, the emerging character of the Iron Tenth. The Diasporex were a fleet-based civilization, a sprawling mobile society of humans and Xenos living together across a mobile fleet that had been wandering the stars for so long that it had developed its own culture, traditions, and sense of identity entirely separate from the Imperium that had once been its point of origin. They had survived for centuries in the void through a combination of alien technology, human adaptability, and the kind of fierce independence that comes from being permanently beyond anyone's reach. Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children conducted the campaign against the Diasporex together, their legions working in combination, the Iron Hands providing the heavy siege capacity and tactical tenacity, the Emperor's children contributing speed and the particular aggression that marked their style before corruption warped it into something unrecognizable. The campaign required innovative thinking because the enemy's mobility made standard planetary assault approaches useless. You cannot besiege a fleet, you have to catch it, and catching something designed to escape is its own tactical problem. What is remembered about this campaign is not the tactical brilliance it required, though there was genuine brilliance involved. What is remembered is the moment when Fulgrim's ship came under fire and faced destruction, and Ferrus Manus turned his flagship around to save him. This was not the tactically optimal decision. It cost the Iron Hands resources and exposed their vessels to additional risk. It was the decision of someone who placed his brother's life above the abstract requirements of the tactical situation. And Fulgrim, already being slowly transformed by the demon blade he'd recovered from the alien world of Leren, could apparently no longer recognize it for what it was. He saw calculation, he saw politics, he saw anything except the simplest explanation, that Ferrus cared about him and acted accordingly. This detail matters for everything that followed. The corruption that was consuming Fulgrim was not yet complete at this stage, but its direction was already clear. The Phoenician was becoming something that processed loyalty as strategy, friendship as leverage, and the genuine emotional connections that had once defined his relationship with the Gorgon as variables in a calculation. He could not fully receive what Ferrus was offering because the lens through which he was reading it had been warped. And Ferrus, for his part, was heading toward Istvan Fife with the absolute conviction that his relationship with Fulgrim meant something, that they were, despite everything, brothers. And that conviction would be weaponized against him in the most devastating way possible. The Iron Tenth's relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus deepened considerably during the Great Crusade years. The Mechanicus maintained a network of forge worlds throughout the galaxy, and the Iron Hands developed a practice of garrisoning and providing protection for these facilities in exchange for priority access to equipment, augmetic components, and the specialized technical knowledge that their increasingly cybernetic warriors required. This arrangement grew into something genuinely mutual. The Mechanicus discovered that the Iron Hands not only understood their philosophy better than any other Space Marine Legion, but could engage with the technical aspects of augmentation and machine maintenance at a level that other legions' tech marines could not match. Iron Hands warriors who served alongside Mechanicus forces didn't just protect them, they participated in the work. And the work, for both sides, felt less like collaboration between different cultures and more like the recognition of a shared one. Thus, the Legion's reputation within the wider Great Crusade command structure was defined by reliability over glory. Some legions produced individual heroes whose names echoed across the galaxy, warriors celebrated for single legendary acts that carried symbolic weight beyond their tactical significance. The Iron Hands produced warriors who showed up, assessed the problem, and solved it, consistently, reliably, without the drama of heroic narrative or the need for their sacrifices to be witnessed and commemorated. Ferrus Manus was not a Primarch who sought celebrations. He sought results, and the culture of the 10th Legion reflected this. They measured themselves by outcomes, not by the stories told about them. Part 4. Fulgrim's Visit. And the thing that followed it, the betrayal of Ferrus Manus, did not begin at Istvan Fife. It began before that, in his own sanctum, aboard his own flagship, in what should have been an intimate conversation between brothers. Fulgrim came to him, came in person, before the wider betrayal became public, at a time when the Warmaster Horus Lupercal's rebellion was still a thing known only to those already committed to it, came, presumably, with real hope, or something that had once been real hope before it was processed through the corrupting influence of the Slayer Neshi demon blade that had been whispering in Fulgrim's mind since he recovered it from the alien world of Laeran. Came to the one Primarch who, of all of them, he might have expected to consider reasonable arguments about breaking with the Emperor. He was wrong, catastrophically, violently wrong.
Okay, real quick, stepping out the lore for just a second. I genuinely find the Iron Hands one of the harder chapters to sit with, and I mean that as a compliment. Most 40k factions give you something to hold on to, a noble cause, a cool aesthetic, maybe a sense of fun. The Iron Hands just hand you a mirror and go quiet. The whole chapter is basically asking, if you decided that feeling things was a liability, what would you become? And the answer they've spent 10,000 years arriving at is something very effective and very lonely, and I'm not entirely sure it made the right call. That's the kind of lore that sticks with me, not the epic battles or the Primarch mythology, though I love all of that too. It's the quiet stuff, the philosophy, wearing armor. That's what I started this channel to dig into, and the Iron Hands are about as deep as it gets. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Ferrus Manus was not a Primarch prone to careful listening when his deepest loyalties were challenged. He was a being of profound conviction and explosive temper, and the proposition that he betray everything he believed in and the father who had given him purpose, delivered by the being he had considered his closest friend, produced a response that the diplomatic language of Imperial history has trouble adequately describing. He attacked Fulgrim. A duel followed, brief and violent. Ferrus destroyed the sword he had forged for Fulgrim years ago, Fireblade, a sword that had been a gift of genuine friendship, and that burned between them now like the symbol of everything that was ending. Fulgrim escaped the encounter, but took something, the thunder hammer called Forgebreaker, which he himself had crafted for Ferrus as a reciprocal gift, and which he now stole back in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously petty and weighted with the symbolism of friendship's end. He also attacked the Iron Hands fleet as he fled. The surprise strike crippled the 10th Legion's naval capability in ways that would have consequences at Istvan Fussif. Consequences in the form of Ferrus arriving at the engagement with fewer ships, fewer warriors, and more urgency than the situation warranted. Because Ferrus didn't wait for the rest of his legion, he couldn't. The fury was too enormous, and the opportunity seemed too immediate. He gathered his most elite warriors, 10 full companies of the Morlocks, of the Terminators who represented the apex of what the 10th Legion could field, and he departed for the Istvan system without the measured preparation that cold tactical logic would have demanded. His brother Primarchs at the engagement, Corax of the Raven Guard and Vulcan of the Salamanders, were uneasy about the assault plan from the beginning. The Raven Guard's reconnaissance had confirmed that the traitor forces at Istvan Fife were heavily fortified in the Urgal Depression, a natural killbox of a canyon system that Horus had improved with void shields and gun emplacements, and defensive works representing months of meticulous preparation. The Loyalists were attacking their strongest front. The terrain favoured the defender. The odds were, at best, equal. Roughly 30,000 traitor Space Marines defending against around 172,000 Loyalists. But the advantage of fortified positions and prepared defensive networks somewhat offset the numerical difference. Most troubling, the 4 supposedly loyal legions of the second wave were nowhere to be found. Their void assets were absent from the system. Corax and Vulcan both noted this and were deeply concerned by what it might imply. Ferrus, driven by the fury that his legion would spend 10 millennia analysing and blaming him for, dismissed their caution and ordered the assault. The first wave landed. The Loyalists fought through the killing ground with extraordinary valour. Against the sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, and the Emperor's children, 3 legions of loyal Space Marines threw themselves forward and began to push back the defenders. Whereas Ferrus Manus personally led his Morlocks straight through the centre of the traitor line. The battle was brutal and costly, but it was working. The Loyalists were making progress. The traitor line was bending. The assault was finding purchase in the most fortified ground in the system. Then the second wave arrived. The Night Lords of Conrad Kurz, the Iron Warriors of Perturabo, the Word-Bearers of Lorgar, the Alpha Legion of Alfarius, 4 legions who had been hidden behind the screen of their apparent loyalty, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, positioned behind the first wave with their weapons ready and their intent already decided. They came down behind the Loyalists. They formed a line, and then they opened fire on their brothers. The trap was complete. All caught between the reforming traitor legions ahead of them and the newly revealed traitors behind. With no retreat route and no means of calling for help in any form that could arrive in time to matter, the three loyalist legions were ground between two sets of enemy forces, like grain between millstones. The battlefield of the Urgal Depression became a slaughterhouse of a scale that had no precedent in the history of the Legiones Astartes. Titan war machines walked the ground and left craters the size of city blocks. The hooded agents of the Dark Mechanicum deployed technologies stolen from ancient repositories to add new varieties of horror to the existing catalogue. Bodies covered the black sand so thickly that movement became difficult. For a warrior to fall on Istvan Fife was not, necessarily, to die immediately. What the battlefield conditions were such that the wounded lay where they fell, and the forces of the War Master moved through the field afterward to ensure that no wounded enemy would become a recovered one. Survivors have described the sounds of those hours after the battle's final decision, the systematic quality of what was being done, the mechanical thoroughness with which the result was made permanent. These were Space Marines killing Space Marines, not in the heat of battle, with its chaos and its selective attention, but methodically, deliberately, each traitor warrior contributing to an outcome whose specific horror lay precisely in how deliberately it was achieved. The Raven Guard and the Salamanders suffered catastrophically. They were not destroyed as completely as the Iron Hands, but the nature of their losses was shaped by their chapter characters. The Raven Guard scattered into the wilderness of Istvan Fire's environment and fought a prolonged guerrilla survival operation, while the Salamanders fought with the absolute refusal to leave their wounded that defines their culture and paid for it in numbers. Vulcan himself was taken prisoner by Konrad Kurzi and subjected to an extended campaign of torture and murder that constitutes one of the most disturbing prolonged sequences in all the Horus Heresy novels. The Night Haunter repeatedly killed and then somehow lost the Primarch, because Vulcan's physiology kept returning him to life in ways that even post-human biology shouldn't accommodate. The Iron Hands received the sharpest cut. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment, because they convey something about the scope of the catastrophe that no description quite manages. The Iron Hands lost 92% of their warriors on that day. Out of a legion already diminished by Fulgrim's surprise attack on their fleet, the survivors numbered in the hundreds, approximately 734 warriors from a full legion, carrying nothing but their lives, the gene seed of thousands of fallen brothers, and the kind of psychological damage that doesn't have a name because it exceeds what language was designed to describe. Ferrus Manus himself died on Istvan V. He and Fulgrim met in single combat. Former friends, former brothers, now representatives of everything that stood on opposite sides of the universe's most important war. Fulgrim wielded the demon blade from Leren, a weapon saturated with the attention of Slanesh, and Ferrus fought with everything he had ever been. The smith who drowned a necrodermis worm in magma, the builder who made beauty out of raw material, the warrior who charged into battle against impossible odds because hesitation wasn't part of his design. He lost. Fulgrim took his head. The trophy was delivered to Horus as proof of the deed, carried across the black sand of Istvan Fuf like a statement of purpose about what this war was going to be. And the 10th Legion was left in pieces, scattered across a killing field, carrying a wound that no augmentation in the universe would ever be able to fully close. The Iron Hands have never formally accepted Ferrus as dead. 10,000 years on, they maintain that his body was never recovered, that the chapter is awaiting his return at the end of times. As the Medusan clans share a prophecy that when the volcano at the Ice Pinnacle, the place where Ferrus first arrived on Medusa, finally ceases its rumbling, it will mark the second coming of the Great Primarch, and even Medusa's volcanoes will at last be content. It hasn't gone quiet yet. Part 5. The Shattering. What breaks and what grows in the cracks. The survivors of Istvan Fife didn't come home immediately. Some of them couldn't. They were dispersed across the system in whatever transport had survived, carrying whatever they could carry. making whatever calculations were available to people whose entire world had just been turned inside out. Was what happened in the immediate aftermath is worth understanding, because it established the psychological and ideological direction the Iron Hands would carry for everything that followed. Grief and rage competed in the minds of surviving warriors with shame and the desperate need to assign meaning to what had happened, because the alternative, that their Primarch and the majority of their legion had been wiped out because of a strategic situation that couldn't have been anticipated and couldn't have been countered, was intolerable in a way that defied rational processing. Something had failed, that much was certain, and for a legion built on the philosophy that failure represented weakness, the question of what had failed became the most important question they could ask. What their answer was devastating in its implications. Flesh had failed, emotion had failed. Ferrus Manus had allowed his fury at Fulgrim's betrayal to drive him into the assault before he was properly prepared. He had let passion override calculation. He had trusted someone he should not have trusted, because his attachment to his closest brother was a form of vulnerability. And vulnerabilities get exploited. The legions had been betrayed in the first place because some of their brothers had been susceptible to chaos in ways that would not have been possible if they had been more mechanical, more logical, less subject to the fears and ambitions and desires that chaos preys upon. This was a reasonable conclusion if you squinted at it from the right angle, but it was not entirely an accurate one. Ferrus didn't die because he was too human. He died because Horus spent months meticulously setting a trap with 8 legions worth of resources and the element of strategic surprise. But the Iron Hands were not, in the immediate aftermath of catastrophic trauma, operating at the level of nuanced causal analysis. They were operating at the level of people trying to build a framework that made their survival mean something, that gave their continuation a purpose beyond merely existing after most of their brothers didn't. The framework they built was the tempering. Not a single moment, not a decree issued at a specific council meeting, but a gradual hardening of attitude that began informally among the surviving Iron Fathers and gradually became doctrine. The conclusion they reached was that the failure at Istvan von Fife was fundamentally a failure of the biological, of the emotional, your passionate, vulnerable properties that came packaged with organic consciousness. The solution, therefore, was systematic. Remove the emotional, purge the irrational, replace the biological wherever possible. Build walls inside the mind against the kind of feeling that had made Ferrus charge when he should have waited, that had made him trust when he should have been suspicious. Become cold enough, logical enough, mechanical enough that chaos could find no purchase in you. It is worth sitting with how comprehensible this response is, even as you recognize how catastrophically incomplete it is. These were warriors who had just watched their Primarch killed, their brothers massacred, everything they'd built and believed in nearly destroyed in a single day. The pain of that experience was enormous, and they lived in a galaxy where pain is, in the most literal sense, dangerous, where grief and rage and despair are the specific emotional textures that the gods of chaos feed on, where the amplitude of your suffering is a measure of your vulnerability to the worst forces in the universe. Deciding to be less vulnerable by being less capable of that kind of pain is, in its specific context, rational, survivable, maybe even smart. What it isn't is free. The thing you seal away to protect yourself doesn't disappear. It waits. A significant force of survivors gathered under the command of Shadrach Meduson, a Terran-born Iron Hand, who had not been part of the initial assault and had therefore survived the massacre without the particular psychological damage that direct experience of it inflicted. Meduson was, by the accounts that survive, as a figure of extraordinary quality, a warrior who understood that the way forward was not through isolation and rage, but through coordinated action, who brought together survivors from all 3 shattered legions and built from them something that functioned like a new operational force. The resulting coalition became known as the Shattered Legions, and their campaign against the traitor forces was conducted with exactly the kind of patient, methodical, utterly relentless guerrilla warfare that survivors with nothing left to lose execute best. They weren't fighting to win the war. The numbers weren't there for that. They were fighting to cost the traitors something every time they came out of the shadows. To be a persistent, painful, infuriating presence in the War Master's rear area, and to demonstrate that the bodies left on the black sand of Istvan Fife had not simply ended. Another significant figure from this period was Autek Moore, an Iron Hands leader who pursued a different approach, gathering a substantial force around himself and devoting it entirely to the maximum destruction of traitor resources wherever they could be found. Moore's most noted action was the complete obliteration of Bot, a World Eater's recruitment world. Not damaged, not occupied, obliterated. A statement written in the language of planetary destruction that the Iron Hands were not interested in symbolic victories. They were interested in permanent solutions. The Horus heresy lasted 7 years after Istvan Fife before the Siege of Terror finally ended it with the War Master's death. And in those 7 years, the surviving Iron Hands fought across dozens of theatres, in formations ranging from full company strength to small bands of warriors operating independently in regions where no one else was willing or able to go. They fought with the particular fury of beings who had lost almost everything and were not entirely certain what they were fighting for anymore, whether it was the Emperor or the memory of Ferrus Manus, or simply the requirement to continue hitting the people responsible for what had been done to them until the hitting stopped meaning anything. When the Codex Astartes divided the legions into chapters after the heresy, the Iron Hands had been so thoroughly destroyed that they could only generate 2 successor chapters from their surviving gene seed, the Brazen Claws and the Red Talons, and the latter drawing primarily from the warriors of Clan Moragul, who had arrived at Istvan vom Firth after the massacre rather than being caught in it, and who had conducted the rest of the war with a particular intensity as a result. The family of the Gorgon would always be notably small, a permanent accounting of what Istvan Fife cost them, written in the very fact of their limited lineage. The survivors returned to Medusa, and they began building the chapter that would carry the name and the grievance and the philosophy of the Iron Hands through 10 more millennia. They built something extraordinary and something troubling and something that is still in the process of deciding what it ultimately is. It is worth considering for a moment what those survivors actually carried with them when they went home. Not physically, the equipment, but the gene seed, the records and relics they managed to salvage from the disaster, the psychological cargo, the interior weight. They had watched their Primarch die, not heard about it, not received a report, not processed it as information, watched. The Morlocks who charged through the center of the line with Ferrus Manus and fought beside him until the end had experienced the combat death of the being they had sworn their entire existence to serve, the closest thing to a god that most of them had ever encountered, a figure of impossible capability and profound personal significance. And they had been unable to prevent it. The weight of that, for warriors whose entire self-concept was built around their capacity to overcome obstacles through superior force and preparation, was not something that any amount of martial training had equipped them to handle, and they came home to a world that would not mourn with them. Medusa does not mourn. Medusa produces people who look at loss and ask what adjustment needs to be made in response to prevent similar losses in the future. The Iron Hands had come from Medusa, and they could feel its logic pulling at them even as the grief was still fresh. Analyze the failure, identify the cause, build the correction, move forward. So they did. But the grief didn't go away just because they'd made a decision to treat it as a tactical problem. It went somewhere else instead. And where it went, it sat in the dark and grew and accumulated alongside the grief of every subsequent campaign, every subsequent loss, as every battle brother killed in subsequent wars, whose death was processed as data rather than experienced as the loss it was. For 10,000 years, the reconstruction of the chapter from those few hundred survivors was necessarily slow. A chapter of roughly 1,000 Space Marines normally requires decades to recruit and train replacements for significant losses. The Iron Hands had lost 92% of their strength. The math was brutal, and the timeline reflected it. For generations after Istvan Fife, the chapter operated below strength, smaller than it should have been, cautious in ways that the Iron Hand's character made genuinely uncomfortable, a rebuilding from the cellular level upward, while simultaneously fighting the ongoing wars that the Great Rift would one day make worse, but that never entirely stopped even in calmer centuries. Part 6. The Philosophy. What the flesh is weak actually means the motto is almost too familiar at this point. The flesh is weak. It appears on Iron Hand's iconography. It features in descriptions of the chapter in virtually every codex and sourcebook. It's the first thing anyone mentions when describing them. And because it's so familiar, it's easy to let it slide past without really listening to it, to treat it as atmospheric flavor rather than the genuine technical assessment it represents. So let's actually listen to it. Yes, the Iron Hands are not speaking metaphorically when they say the flesh is weak. They're not using weakness as a stand-in for some other concept, some spiritual inadequacy or moral failing that happens to be expressed in biological terms. They mean it mechanically, literally, specifically, and if you engage with the claim seriously, it's harder to dismiss than it might initially seem. Flesh ages. It has a finite operating lifespan that cannot be meaningfully extended past certain limits regardless of enhancement. It is subject to disease and biological attack in ways that metal simply isn't. A bacterial infection that kills an unaugmented human will not affect a bionic arm. A viral agent engineered to attack the central nervous system cannot infect a machine. Flesh can be corrupted by chemicals, by parasites, or by the particular energies of the warp that the setting establishes as real and dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with superstition. A being whose biology has been substantially replaced with mechanical systems is simply less vulnerable to many categories of attack that biological beings face constantly. Flesh also, the Iron Hands would argue, produces emotion, and emotion, in the context of their specific history, their specific losses, and the specific mechanics of what chaos is and how it operates, is something that carries risk. Anger can drive you into battle before you're prepared, as happened at Istvan. Love can make you extend yourself past the point of tactical safety to protect someone you care about. Grief can compromise judgment, reduce combat effectiveness, which create the kind of psychological raw material that entities hostile to humanity have learned to exploit. Fear is a known vector for chaos corruption. Even positive emotions, attachment, loyalty, devotion, can be turned against you if the being you're attached to, loyal to, devoted to, is either a traitor or a target. The logic of the tempering is therefore not simply emotional suppression for its own sake. It's a security protocol. If you eliminate the emotional vectors through which chaos traditionally operates, you make yourself substantially harder to corrupt. A warrior who has mastered or eliminated grief, rage, fear, attachment, who processes these as data rather than experiencing them as conditions, is genuinely more resistant to the specific threats that destroy Space Marines from the inside. The Horus heresy happened, as in no small part, because chaos found purchase in emotions, in Fulgrim's vanity and desire for perfection, in Lorga's need for his faith to be validated, in the resentments and grievances that had been quietly accumulating in several Primarchs for years. The Iron Hand's response to this is not without logic. It's just not without cost either. What you lose when you suppress or eliminate emotional experience is not nothing. The things that chaos can corrupt are also the things that make continued existence meaningful. The love of brothers, the sense of purpose that comes from caring about something, the ability to experience the full range of what consciousness can produce. A being who has successfully eliminated these vectors is more resistant to certain forms of attack, but they are also, in a very real sense, poorer than they were. As the Gardenian heresy would demonstrate in the most visceral possible way, what you suppress doesn't disappear, it waits. In darkness that you've deliberately not looked into, it sits and accumulates. And when something reaches in and touches it, the response can be more violent and more uncontrolled than it would have been if you'd simply let yourself feel it in the first place. The physical expression of all of this is the cybernetics program. A space marine who joins the Iron Hands at initiation has already undergone, as all space marines do, the extensive biological modification process, the additional organs, the enhanced physiology, the modifications that transform a promising human into something that exceeds ordinary human capability in virtually every measurable dimension. The Iron Hands accept this foundation and then set about building on it with the systematic focus of engineers who believe that any system can be improved through careful analysis and the replacement of underperforming components. The first augmentation comes at initiation, when a neophyte achieves the rank of full battle brother. His left hand is removed and replaced with a bionic prosthetic. This is not a consequence of injury, it is a ceremony, a statement of belief performed in the most personal and irreversible terms available to him. Some brothers have the limb removed in the chapter's surgical facilities by Iron Fathers with full anesthetic support. Others choose to perform the amputation themselves. Some, and this detail says something important about the culture they're joining, submerge the hand in one of Medusa's volcanic flows and draw back the stump without anesthetic, because the pain is the point. Because enduring the pain and replacing the organic with the mechanical while the pain is still present is a demonstration of exactly what the chapter believes, that the flesh is a first draft that you are now actively revising. And then it doesn't stop. Over the decades and centuries of service, the augmentations accumulate. Bionic eyes that function across spectrums invisible to unaided human vision, that can process more data than biological visual systems and do it more quickly, that never tire and never weep and never flinch. Mechanical arms with multiple times the strength of gene-engineered organic muscle. Was cranial implants that interface the warrior's consciousness directly with the machine systems around him, allowing him to experience vehicles and weapons as extensions of his own body, rather than tools he operates from the outside. Servo mechanisms woven into the nervous system that augment reaction time and processing speed. Internal organ backups, structural reinforcements along the spine and skeletal system, chemical systems for emotion regulation that are, depending on how you look at them, either the most responsible form of the tempering or its most sinister expression. A warrior who is several centuries old and has served the Iron Hands throughout might appear, from the outside, almost entirely mechanical, every visible surface gleaming metal, maintained with the devotion that other cultures reserve for religious artifacts. The occasional pale patch of human skin preserved by necessity, because you need some organic tissue, because the brain must be housed, because certain biological functions cannot be mechanically replicated without crossing into territory even the Iron Hands hesitate to approach, but largely covered by the accumulated work of generations of surgical improvement. Some go further. The whispers speak of warriors who have surrendered everything they can, who have crossed the threshold where the organic content of their bodies consists of little more than the brain and the immediately essential supporting organs, who are, in every practical external sense, machines that contain a person, or, the uncomfortable philosophical counterpoint suggests, machines that used to contain a person and now contain something that remembers having been one. As the Iron Hands do not find this alarming, they find it inspiring, the logical terminus of the path they've been walking, the closest available approximation of perfection for beings who started as flesh. There is a particular quality to the way Iron Hands warriors move in full augmentation that veterans of other chapters find hard to categorize. They are quieter than they should be, given the amount of machinery involved. The constant maintenance and calibration of bionic systems produces warriors who understand their own mechanical components well enough to keep them from the incidental sounds that poorly maintained bionics produce. They move with a deliberateness that is not slowness. Iron Hands warriors are as fast in combat as their genetics require, but rather precision, with the precision of beings who have thought carefully about every movement and eliminated the inefficient ones. They stand in formation with a stillness that is not the tension of a coiled spring, but the patience of a machine in standby mode, completely inactive until there is a reason to be active, reserving no energy for the kind of ambient physical restlessness that human bodies tend toward. Older warriors in full augmentation develop something that other chapters' warriors occasionally describe as unsettling, a slight delay between stimulus and response that is not the hesitation of doubt, but the lag of processing. When an Iron Father addresses a heavily augmented veteran about a matter of doctrine, there is sometimes a pause before the answer comes. Not the pause of someone choosing their words carefully, but the pause of someone whose organic processing has to coordinate with a significant amount of mechanical system integration before a response can be composed. The machine is thinking. The question is whether the person is still there to participate in that thinking, or whether the machine has become efficient enough that the person's involvement is increasingly ceremonial. The Iron Hand's own answer to this question is that the person becomes the machine, that the distinction dissolves in the process of perfection rather than one thing replacing the other. But this is doctrine, and the chapter's own history contains too many moments where that doctrine was used to justify things that produce consequences the doctrine claimed it was preventing for the answer to be entirely satisfying. As Part 7, Iron Fathers, the Iron Council, and the architecture of governance without a master, every institution the Iron Hands have built carries the philosophical fingerprint of Istvan V. Every place where their organization departs from the standard Space Marine model encodes a specific lesson from that specific disaster, translated into structural design. Begin with the most fundamental departure. The Iron Hands have no chapter master. This is not an accident, and it is not an oversight. It is a deliberate architectural decision made by the Iron Fathers who are rebuilding the chapter in the immediate aftermath of the Horus Heresy. And it is still in force 10,000 years later. A chapter master is a single point of authority, and a single point of authority is, or by definition, a single point of failure. If that single authority figure's judgment can be compromised by fury, by grief, by love, by the very passionate qualities that made them the kind of leader people followed, then concentrating all power in that figure is precisely the structural flaw that produced Istvan V. So no chapter master. In his place, the Iron Council. The council consists of representatives from each of the 10 clan companies, typically the Iron Fathers who lead those companies, meeting collectively to decide matters of chapter-wide importance. The deliberative structure distributes the function of governance across 10 minds rather than concentrating it in one, which makes the overall judgment of the system more robust than any individual component. Any one of them can be wrong, compromised, or compromised in ways they aren't aware of. The others remain as check and correction. The Iron Council can appoint one of its members to serve as overall war leader for a specific campaign, granting them, for the duration of that campaign, all the practical authority of a chapter master. But when the campaign ends, the authority returns to the council, and the appointed leader steps back into his role as one member among equals. This is how Cardan Stronos, the most significant figure in the modern chapter, technically holds his position. He was appointed war leader, performed extraordinarily well, and has been reappointed at every subsequent opportunity for over 300 years. Whether that constitutes a de facto chapter master under another name is a philosophical question the Iron Hands prefer not to examine too closely. But the Iron Fathers are an institution unique to the chapter, combining in a single figure roles that every other Space Marine organization keeps strictly separate. In a standard chapter, chaplains handle the spiritual dimension, culture, tradition, faith, the maintenance of the chapter's psychological and ideological coherence. Tech Marines handle the technical dimension, equipment maintenance, weapon systems, vehicle repair, the keeping things running that makes a military force functional. These are separate career paths with separate training, separate authorities, and sometimes genuinely separate worldviews about what matters most. Iron Fathers are both, and additionally, essentially, apothecaries in the sense that they oversee the augmentation surgeries that their brothers undergo throughout their lives. They carry spiritual authority and technical expertise and surgical responsibilities simultaneously because the chapter sees no meaningful distinction between these domains. The spirit of a warrior, the maintenance of his equipment, and the improvement of his physical form are all aspects of the same optimization project. Managing all three is one job. The training of an Iron Father reflects this comprehensiveness. They receive theological and philosophical education sufficient to guide the ideological development of new warriors. They receive Mechanicus training extensive enough that many have been formally inducted as Tech Marines. They develop surgical expertise sufficient to perform the bionic procedures their charges will require throughout their service lives. And they are expected to do all of this simultaneously in the field, because the practical demands of keeping a chapter of heavily augmented Space Marines operational don't align neatly with a division of duties that might work better in more administratively comfortable circumstances. Iron Fathers also serve as the most visible face of the chapter's spiritual life. They preach. They remind their battle brothers of the values that define what it means to be Iron Hands: the rejection of weakness, the embrace of the machine, the ongoing commitment to improvement, the memory of the Gorgon. They promise, in terms that are simultaneously sincere and somewhat hard to evaluate factually, that one day their lost Primarch will return, and they need to be worthy of him when he does. They conduct the rituals of the chapter, the blessing of iron, through which new augmentations are formally integrated. It's the taking of the soul steel, which is the name given to the process of absorbing Iron Hand's gene seed, and which involves the neophyte purging themselves of fear, pain, and anger through mantras of cold logic. The blessing of iron is worth a few extra words, because it reveals something about how the chapter relates to its own practices. When a warrior undergoes a new augmentation, whether the initiation amputation of his left hand or any of the subsequent replacements and enhancements that will accumulate over a career, the procedure is not simply medical. It is presided over by an Iron Father who performs specific liturgical acts, both before and after. Prayers in Medusan, in High Gothic, and in the binary cant of the Mechanicus, just because the Iron Hands consider all three languages to be equally appropriate for communicating with the machine spirits they believe inhabit their augmentations. The augmentation itself is sanctified with oils, which is a practice borrowed from Mechanicus ritual, and then the new component is formally introduced to the warrior it now belongs to in a ceremony that treats the bionic as a new member of a relationship, not merely a replacement part installed in a system. This fusion of engineering and spirituality is, arguably, one of the most distinctive things about the Iron Hands. More distinctive in a way than the augmentations themselves. There are other chapters and organizations in the Imperium that make heavy use of bionics. Only the Iron Hands treat the act of replacing your own flesh with metal as a genuinely sacred act, and one that requires ritual acknowledgement because something meaningful is being done. Whether this is philosophically coherent, whether metal can be sacred, whether machine spirits are real in the way the chapter treats them as real, is a question the Iron Hands would regard as tedious. It functions. It produces warriors who approach their own cybernetics with reverence, rather than treating them as mere tools. And function is all the justification the Iron Hands require. The broader governance structure that the Iron Council sits atop is worth understanding in some detail, because it's surprisingly sophisticated for an organization that prides itself on straightforward mechanical thinking. The Council doesn't just adjudicate disputes or approve operational plans, it manages the long-term strategic direction of the chapter, or oversees the succession of Iron Father positions within each clan company, maintains the chapter's relationships with the Adeptus Mechanicus and the wider Imperium, and manages the theological coherence of the tempering as a living doctrine rather than a static text. It is, in other words, something that functions like a government, run by people who would probably bristle at being called politicians, but who perform political functions with considerable skill. The Magi Calculi deserve specific mention in this context. These Adeptus Mechanicus analytical specialists brought into the Iron Hands organizational structure over time as the chapter's relationship with the Mechanicus deepened. function as something like the Council's analytical arm. They assess strategic situations, run probability calculations on proposed operations, model the likely outcomes of different approaches, and present their findings to the Iron Fathers. Their analysis is treated with enormous respect because it aligns with the chapter's preference for data-driven decision-making. Their recommendations are taken seriously, and, as the Indomitus Crusade would demonstrate, they can be overruled when the Council determines that something beyond calculation is required. That the Council is capable of this override, that after 10,000 years of building a culture around mechanical logic, the warriors in those chambers can still make decisions that the numbers don't recommend, is perhaps the most important single fact about the Iron Hand's current trajectory. They also, when the time comes, oversee the internment of warriors into dreadnoughts. And it is here that the chapter's philosophy finds its most spectacular and most revealing expression. In most Space Marine chapters, being interred in a dreadnought is understood as a form of honoured continuation. A warrior who would otherwise die from catastrophic injury is instead preserved and given a new mechanical form. It's a mercy, an honour. But it is tinged with grief in most chapters, because the warrior who emerges is genuinely different from the one who went in. He sleeps for long periods between battles, waking to fight and then returning to stasis. He slowly loses his connection to the world, slowly forgets what it was like to be flesh, slowly becomes something that carries the memories of a man but operates with the logic of a machine. The Iron Hands do not experience this as tragedy. For them, being interred in a dreadnought is the logical culmination of everything their philosophy has been building towards since their first augmentation on the day of their initiation. Every bionic replacement, every surgical session, every ritual of the tempering has been pointing in this direction, the complete replacement of the fallible organic with the unyielding mechanical. The dreadnought is not a prison they are condemned to. It is an achievement they have been working toward. The greatest honour the chapter can offer. The most complete expression of what they believe a warrior should be. The ancient dreadnoughts of the Iron Hands have been awake, in their episodic way, for centuries or millennia. They carry in their mechanical memories the accumulated experience of campaigns that no living warrior remembers. They participate in the governance of the chapter. Some sit on the Iron Council itself, their towering armoured forms arranged in the council chamber alongside the biological Iron Fathers, their mechanical voices weighted with the authority of ages of service. The dreadnought is not the end of an Iron Hands warrior's story. It is its final and most definitive chapter. The flesh, in the end, is fully replaced by iron. Part 8. Medusa's nomadic fortresses, the clan companies and their wandering war machines. The organisational depth of the Iron Hands extends far beneath the level of the Iron Council, down through the clan structure that reflects both the ancient heritage of their homeworld and the deliberate philosophical choices made in the chapter's reconstruction. While each of the 10 clan companies is modelled directly on the clan structure of Medusa, and the correspondence is genuine rather than merely ceremonial, the 10 clans from which the original Medusan Iron Hands drew their identity, Moragul, Relkan, Averni, Vergan, Garsak, Soragol, Gravehold, and the rest, each correspond to a clan company. Warriors share the specific traditions, iconography, ritual practices, and often the characteristic approaches to warfare associated with their founding clan. They aren't just a company that happens to wear a particular symbol. They are the inheritors of a specific tradition, a specific way of being Iron Hands, that has its own history and its own emphases within the chapter's broader culture. The companies operate with substantial autonomy. Each recruits directly from its corresponding Medusan clan. Each manages its own equipment, its own armory, its own internal politics and rivalry, and the particular flavours of pride and competitiveness that define each company's relationship to the others. There is coordination at the Iron Council level. Obviously, that's what the Council exists for. But the day-to-day operation of each clan company is its own affair, and each company maintains its own mobile fortress, the land behemoths. The name gives you the scale. These are not simple transport vehicles or mobile command posts. They are enormous track structures, vast crawling machines that carry entire clan companies, their warriors, their equipment, their forges, their data vaults, their surgical facilities, their training spaces, their council rooms. Self-contained city fortresses on treads, rolling continuously across the surface of Medusa in an eternal patrol, watching the nomadic clans below for candidates worthy of recruitment, maintaining the chapter's presence on their homeworld, without ever being still enough to be vulnerable to whatever geological event Medusa next decides to offer. The scale of these machines is almost difficult to visualize in the abstract. Each land behemoth is larger than many Imperial warships. Some have been in continuous operation for so long that their original construction records are lost to the accumulated maintenance logs of centuries. They have been repaired and modified and extended and rebuilt so many times that the machine existing today shares only the philosophical continuity of purpose with the machine that was originally commissioned. Every component has been replaced, sometimes multiple times, but the machine continues, which the Iron Hands find entirely appropriate as a metaphor for their own existence. The ship of Theseus is not a paradox to them. It is an aspiration. The forges aboard the behemoths are where Iron Hands warriors spend a significant portion of their between-battle time, and this is not coincidental. Craftsmanship, the act of working with metal and machinery, of taking raw material and transforming it through skill and understanding into something that functions better than it did before, is not merely recreation for Iron Hands warriors. It is a continuation of their philosophical practice, creating a weapon or a piece of armor or a bionic component with your own hands, understanding every element of its construction, so knowing its tolerances and its strengths and the precise conditions under which it might fail, is a form of engagement with the machine that the chapter values as much as combat. Some of the finest artificer armor in the Imperium was made in the rolling forges of Medusa's behemoths. The detail and quality of the work reflects not just technical skill, but genuine investment. The understanding that what you make is an extension of who you are, and therefore it should be as good as you can make it. The nomadic quality is, again, philosophical as much as practical. The Iron Hands don't have a single fixed fortress monastery that all 10 companies share. They have 10 fortress monasteries, each one mobile, each one independent, each expressing the specific culture of its clan. What the decentralization that began at the level of governance, no chapter master, decisions distributed across the Iron Council, extends downward through the architecture of the chapter's physical presence on its homeworld. The clans do not always like each other. This, too, is preserved by design. The competitive tradition of Medusan culture didn't end when those clans became space marines. The Iron Hands actively maintain a degree of rivalry between their companies, in the belief that competition is one of the most reliable mechanisms for producing excellence. Different clan companies have different reputations, different approaches to warfare, different cultural emphases that have developed over millennia of parallel but not always aligned existence. Ishun clan Raukan has a specific and particular relationship with the Emperor's children, the traitors who murdered their Primarch, that drives them to accept risks in engagements against Slaneshi Chaos forces that strict tactical logic would recommend against. This is simultaneously one of their defining characteristics, and the thing that the Scarvus ambush exploited most efficiently. The sons of Horus's descendants made them a target. The Emperor's children made them a motivation. Clan Averni carries the prestige of the Morlocks, the Gorgon's honor guard, the Terminator warriors, who charged straight through the center of the traitor line at Istvan V and died in extraordinary numbers protecting their Primarch. The veterans of Averni carry themselves with a particular weight of history. So Clan Moragul's legacy is written in its successors. The Brazen Claws and the Red Talons both trace their lineage primarily through Moragul, which arrived at Istvan V after the initial massacre and made a fighting withdrawal rather than being caught in the trap. Moragul spent the rest of the heresy fighting in full-pitch battles rather than guerrilla operations, meeting the traitors directly and paying the cost of that approach in blood. It was Moragul who, in one of the more extraordinary acts of the entire war, destroyed the World Eater's primary recruitment world of Bot by literally directing a moon into it, a statement about consequences written in geological language that the Iron Hands found entirely proportionate. The recruitment process that feeds these companies draws from Medusa's ongoing clan competition. Every Medusan knows the Iron Hands are watching. Young warriors from the clans know that performance in the inter-clan competition might catch the attention of the chapter's recruiters. The trials themselves are brutal, even by the chapter's standards. Not standardized across companies, but reflecting each clan's particular traditions and priorities. Physical endurance pushed past limits that should be impossible. Tests of willpower where the question is not what your body can survive, but what your mind will refuse to acknowledge as a limit. Psychological trials designed to identify whether a candidate has the specific quality that Medusa produces and the Iron Hands select for, the ability to look at pain and limitation not as conditions to be accepted, but as problems to be solved. Those who fail may be killed outright. Is their gene seed harvested if it's viable? Or they may become servitors, the mindless cybernetic workers that the chapter uses for support tasks. Beings who were almost Iron Hands, but didn't quite make the threshold and were put to work in a different capacity instead. This sounds brutal because it is. Medusa is brutal. The Iron Hands are Medusa, in the most distilled and concentrated form the world has ever produced. Part 9. The Weight of Iron. Notable battles, dark moments, and the cost of the philosophy. 10,000 years of continuous warfare generates a great deal of history, and the Iron Hands' history has the specific quality you'd expect from a chapter defined by their ideology, brilliantly effective in the conditions the philosophy is suited to, just revealing in deeply uncomfortable ways when those conditions are subverted. Let's start with the Scarvus ambush of 929 M40, because it's a clean example of how the chapter's greatest strength can be weaponized against them. Clan Raukan had been conducting a grinding attritional campaign against a large and mobile orc force in the Myrmidia system, the kind of protracted engagement that Iron Hands warriors are specifically built for. The orcs were bigger and more numerous, but the Iron Hands were more methodical, more patient, and consistently better at making each exchange cost the enemy more than it cost them. It was going by any tactical assessment well. Then the call came in, a distress signal from a freighter called the Endymion, reporting an attack by Emperor's Children Chaos Marines in the nearby Corladian Gulf. Was the Emperor's Children? Fulgrim's corruption. The murderers of the Gorgon. Iron Captain Macklin responded immediately, leaving a token force in Myrmidia and taking more than half of Clan Raukan's battle brothers toward the signal. The instinct that drove him was not irrational exactly. The Emperor's Children are a genuine and serious threat, and chasing them down before they establish a foothold in the region is sound doctrine. But the speed and completeness of the response, the way the priority calculation tilted so sharply toward the opportunity to engage ancient enemies, suggests that something beyond pure tactical logic was at work. The particular weight of history that Raukan carried, the specific emotional investment that the chapter's most ironic failure was preventing. The Endymion was bait. The location was a death world called Scarvus, and the Chaos Marines waiting there were not the uncertain ambushers that the signal's urgency suggested, but the precisely positioned elements of a carefully designed trap. Sonic weapons from concealed positions, overwhelming numbers. The element of surprise lent to the attackers by a target that had been maneuvered into exactly the ground where the advantage would be most decisive. Clan Raukan was torn apart. Both Iron Fathers were killed. A significant fraction of the company's warriors died on Scarvus, and while the survivors were still processing what had happened, the orc force they'd left behind in Myrmidia returned in greater numbers and inflicted enormous damage on the region they'd abandoned. The aftermath was almost as damaging as the engagement itself. The Iron Council held Raukan responsible for the disaster, specifically for allowing the emotional investment in the Emperor's Children to override tactical prudence. The company was disgraced, placed under the strict command of the conservative Iron Father Christos, and subjected to the most intense scrutiny The chapter applies to formations that have been found wanting. The lesson the Council drew was pointed, predictable, and in retrospect somewhat incomplete. Warriors who let feeling drive their decisions are a liability. The tempering exists for a reason. Lean harder into it. Christos was the Iron Father who would lean hardest of all, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The Gardenian heresy of 460.41 is the chapter's most significant internal crisis. It says the most dramatic demonstration of what happens when the philosophy is taken to its logical extreme, and something knows how to reach through the walls it builds. Christos led a substantial force, nearly 800 battle brothers, elements from multiple clan companies, to the Gardenia system, where Emperor's Children activity had been reported. The pattern should be recognized, a specific enemy designed to trigger specific responses in a specific faction. The Sapphire King, the Sleshaneshi daemon at the center of all of this, had been operating in the vicinity of the Iron Hands for a long time. It understood them. More precisely, it had been feeding on them. A demon formed in the aftermath of Ferrus Manus' death, nourishing itself on the repressed emotions and discarded humanity of the Iron Hands, or growing stronger over centuries, as the chapter continued to suppress and deny and seal away the things that made it vulnerable while leaving those things intact to accumulate in darkness. The Sapphire King had laid a trap of extraordinary sophistication, not the simple military ambush that destroyed Raukhan at Scarvus, but something far more insidious. On Gardenia Prime, inside a vast domed industrial complex, the Iron Hands found what appeared to be the ultimate expression of what they had been building toward. Flesh-machine hybrid constructs that seemed to represent the perfect integration of biological and mechanical components, the perfect workers, the perfect servants, the perfect embodiment of everything the tempering had been gesturing toward. Christos embraced them, and in that embrace, the Sapphire King's trap closed. The constructs were not achievements, they were corruption given form, designed specifically to appeal to the specific obsession of this specific target. The moment Christos and his followers began to accept them, in the council chamber of their minds, the place where doctrine lived and the tempering was meant to hold, the corruption took root, demons emerged. The Emperor's Children arrived. The Christosians, their philosophical commitments turned against them with elegant economy, became vectors for exactly the kind of demonic incursion the tempering was supposed to prevent. A third of the Iron Council died, or was corrupted in what followed. Cardan Stronos, then a much younger figure, survived by refusing to accept what Christos was offering, by retreating rather than advancing, and by making the hard choice to gun down corrupted battle brothers rather than let them become something worse. Gardenia Prime was burned from orbit. The Sapphire King was eventually destroyed, but the cost had been enormous. The lesson here was one the Iron Hands found deeply uncomfortable. The philosophy that was supposed to protect them had been used to destroy them. The suppression of emotion hadn't made them invulnerable to Slaneshi corruption. It had made them uniquely vulnerable to a specific variety of it. The variety that offered what they had been denying themselves. The variety that spoke the precise language of their deepest aspirations and offered to make those aspirations real through a door they shouldn't have opened. What had been sealed away was still there, still influencing, still driving decisions and vulnerabilities that the tempering's proponents hadn't accounted for because they'd been too busy congratulating themselves on having sealed it away in the first place. Other campaigns could fill many hours on their own. The Medusa raid saw Chaos Plague forces, including Typhus's First Plague Company, attack the chapter's homeworld directly, doing terrible damage before being driven off in engagements that left permanent scars on both sides. The Iron Crusade, or the invasion of the Stygius sector in the early era Indomitus, brought together a coalition of Iron Hands and successor chapter forces in one of the largest concentrations of Ferrus Manus gene-line warriors since the Legion's division. Sons of Medusa, Brazen Claws, Iron Lords, Fire Lords, Silver Skulls, are all fighting together under the Iron Hands' leadership to reclaim territory from Chaos. The purging of Conquest saw the chapter eliminate Chaos forces from 12 worlds across an entire subsector. a systematic campaign of the kind at which they excelled, concluded by Chief Librarian Telach sacrificing himself to stop Julius Caesarion, former first captain of the Emperor's Children, now a demon prince of Slanesh, in a confrontation that carried the specific weight of 10,000 years of history pressing down on a single moment. There was the Sabist planet strike, in which Clan Raukan launched an assault they perhaps should have assessed more carefully, and Iron Captain Sind Grolvoch was killed by the demon Primarch Fulgrim himself, killed buying time for refugees to escape, as in an act that carried a very specific species of grief for any Iron Hand who witnessed it. Fulgrim again. Always, eventually, Fulgrim again. The wound that never quite heals. Part 10. Cardan Stronos, the Iron Father who looked in the mirror. If the Galdinian heresy had a lesson, it was one that Christos and his followers could not hear. That the complete elimination of emotion doesn't make you stronger. It makes you hollow. And hollow things can be filled with other contents, given sufficient patience from something that knows what you're missing. The man who articulated this lesson in terms the Iron Council could actually receive was Cardan Stronos. His background follows the expected path of an exceptional Iron Hands warrior, as he served for years as Iron Captain of Clan Garsak, before being inducted into the chaplaincy and travelling to Mars for Tech Marine training, the combination that defines the Iron Father rank. His reverence for the machine was genuine, not performed. His disdain for weakness was real and had been earned through long service. He was not a soft character arguing for soft policies. He was an Iron Hand arguing from inside the philosophy that the philosophy as currently being practiced was going to kill them. The specific nature of his argument is important. He wasn't saying that the Iron Hands should feel more and strategize less. He wasn't arguing for emotional excess or the kind of passionate, feeling-driven leadership that he and everyone else in the chapter agreed had contributed to Istvan 5. What he was saying, with the patience and precision of someone who understood both the spiritual and mechanical dimensions of the problem, was that the capacity to feel things was not the liability the tempering claimed it was. The refusal to acknowledge what you felt, the deliberate construction of internal walls to contain and suppress rather than process, was creating exactly the vulnerability the tempering was supposed to eliminate. A warrior who has genuinely processed his grief and made his peace with loss is not controlled by grief. He understands it. He can observe its presence without being driven by it. He can function in its presence without compromising his judgment. A warrior who has buried his grief under iron plating and told himself it doesn't exist is a warrior with a hidden compartment that he's never looked into, busted that he doesn't know the contents of, and that something like the Sapphire King can reach into with devastating effect. Stronos also advanced an argument about chaos resistance that was, in retrospect, theoretically sound, even if the Christosian faction rejected it. That the warp feeds on strong emotions, yes, but it feeds particularly on repressed, extreme, unacknowledged emotions. The Iron Hands, who had been suppressing their grief and fury for centuries, weren't making themselves less available to chaos. They were creating precisely the concentrated, pressurized reservoir of unprocessed feeling that something like the Sapphire King could tap directly. The vacuum created by the tempering was not neutral. It was waiting to be filled. He was elected to lead the Iron Council in the aftermath of the Galdinian disaster, but has been re-elected at every subsequent opportunity, has held the position for more than 300 consecutive years, which makes him the most consistently authoritative leader the chapter has had since the death of Ferrus Manus. Under his leadership, the Iron Council has been expanded to include voices beyond the strictly technical. The composition now draws from chaplains, librarians, apothecaries, veteran sergeants, a broader range of perspectives than the body had previously considered appropriate. The collective wisdom is more varied, less monolithic, less susceptible to the specific blind spots that a council of nothing but Iron Fathers with identical philosophical training will inevitably develop. He has also advanced a heretical-sounding position that he frames in carefully practical terms, that the Iron Hands should learn to master their emotions rather than eliminate them, should engage with what they feel, the grief for Ferrus Manus, the particular fury for Fulgrim and the Emperor's children, the attachment to battle brothers that every warrior carries, regardless of how hard the tempering works to remove it, and understand it well enough that it cannot be used as a weapon against them. This is not a position of weakness. Stronos is insistent on this. Mastery is not indulgence. Controlling your grief is different from pretending you have none. Acknowledging your anger and understanding where it comes from is different from allowing it to drive you into tactical situations that the anger is choosing and not the strategic mind. But the Gorgon's fury was not a weakness in itself. The absence of something that could check and direct that fury was the problem. The tempering, in trying to eliminate the dangerous element, had also eliminated the checking mechanism, and the result was in some ways worse than the original condition. He has also made enemies within the chapter. There are Iron Fathers who have served for centuries, who have built their entire understanding of what it means to be a child of the Gorgon around the specific doctrine that Stronos is revising, and who view his approach with a mixture of concern and what, in more emotional beings, would be called contempt. Whether this ongoing tension between philosophical positions represents the chapter in productive dialogue with itself or in dangerous disagreement remains to be fully resolved. Part 11. The Age of the Dark Imperium. Iron in the Time of Fire. The formation of the Great Rift reshaped everything. Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, the fall of Cadia, the sudden galaxy-spanning tear in reality that divided the Imperium into two isolated halves and unleashed the worst demonic incursions in 10,000 years. This was not a single disaster that could be contained or addressed and then recovered from. It was a state change, a new condition for the entire universe that had to be adapted to rather than solved. The Iron Hands were not spared. Their region of space, the Segmentum Obscurus, positioned near the Eye of Terror, was positioned near this very location where the rift tore most dramatically and with most violence, was among those most severely affected by the rift's birth. Warp storms erupted across the sector, communication was disrupted, travel became unreliable, worlds that had been stable imperial territory fell to demonic incursion or chaos forces that poured through the newly opened wounds in space with no resistance available to stop them. The Iron Hands adapted. They were built for extended campaigns in difficult conditions, and the conditions of the era Indomitus, however horrifying in scale, were recognizable in kind. An enemy to be systematically defeated, a region to be reclaimed, a problem to be solved through the application of sufficient force applied with sufficient precision over sufficient time. From the direct assault on Medusa itself, Chaos Plague forces attacking the chapter's homeworld, Typhus's Death Guard, and the pestilential companies that follow his banner advancing across the volcanic surface against land behemoths that had never in their millennia of operation been required to defend their own world from an enemy of this character, was among the most psychologically significant challenges the Iron Hands faced in the early Rift era. The behemoths are mobile fortresses. They were designed for mobility and self-sufficiency. Turning them into defensive installations against an advancing enemy army was not what they were built for, and adapting their tactical doctrine to the changed requirement required exactly the kind of flexible thinking that the Iron Hands hierarchy finds most difficult. They adapted. It cost them. The plague forces inflicted damage on Medusa's clan population that will take generations to fully recover from, and several of the behemoths were so severely damaged during the fighting that their reconstruction has proceeded in stages even after the enemy was driven off. But Medusa held. The Iron Hands held their home, which was not guaranteed and should not be taken for granted as an outcome, given the forces arrayed against them. The Iron Crusade in the Stygius sector became the most visible expression of this adaptation, not just the Iron Hands themselves, but the broader family of the Gorgon, successors drawn from across the Imperium to fight alongside their founding chapter in the largest concentration of Ferrus Manus gene line warriors in millennia, sons of Medusa, Brazen Claws, Iron Lords, Fire Lords, Silver Skulls, and others, all moving together through the burning chaos of a sector under assault, all fighting with the cold efficiency that the 10th Legion's heritage demands. The Eldar warned that Millennium was lost, that its inhabitants should evacuate. The Iron Hands ignored the warning and went anyway, and Millennium didn't fall. The significance of that choice, to fight for a world that one of the most strategically experienced alien species in the galaxy had assessed as unwinnable, is worth sitting with. The Iron Hands made that call not because their Magi Calculi recommended it, but because the alternative was accepting a defeat that their strategic position could not absorb. Sometimes the correct calculation is the one that says the numbers are wrong, and that the assessment of what's possible depends on the quality of the force making the attempt in ways that probabilistic models can't capture. The warriors of the Iron 10th held Millennium because they were Iron Hands, and Iron Hands don't accept the loss of ground they have decided to hold. On Vigilus, the world straddling the Nachman Gauntlet, one of the only stable passages through the Great Rift, a world that the entire Imperium Nihilus depended on remaining in Imperial hands. Cardan Stronos appeared at the head of 8 clan companies, alongside 2 companies of Brazen Claws, in what became the War of Beasts. The crisis on Vigilus was the specific kind of nightmare that the chapter's methodical and multi-threat management capabilities were suited to, not a single enemy to be defeated, but multiple simultaneous crises requiring independent responses, Orc speed formations, Genestealer cult uprisings, Drukari raiding, the Black Legion's forces under Harkon World Claimer, all of it converging on the same world at the same time, all of it requiring different approaches. The Iron Hands contributed what they always contribute: firepower, durability, and the cold-blooded willingness to calculate acceptable losses without flinching. The Vigilus campaign also brought an unexpected dimension to the chapter's ongoing philosophical development under Stronos, fighting alongside the forces of Rabuta Gilliman, who had returned from the edge of death to lead the Indomitus Crusade, and who represented, in the most literal sense available, as the kind of leadership that the Codex Astartes was designed to produce, created an opportunity for the Iron Hands to observe a governing model fundamentally different from their own. Gilliman's approach involves genuine investment in the survival of specific individuals, clear emotional communication with his forces, the willingness to express grief and anger in ways that motivate rather than compromise. He is not cold, he is not mechanical, and he is extraordinarily effective, which is a data point that even the most conservative Iron Father cannot simply dismiss. Whether this observation has influenced Stronos' thinking is not recorded anywhere in the accessible canon, but the Iron Hands fought well on Vigilus, as Stronos walked away from the campaign having spent months in the operational shadow of a resurrected Primarch who was doing something that the Iron Hands had decided 10,000 years ago was a liability, and evidently decided it wasn't. The Indomitus Crusade, launched by the resurrected Primarch Robuta Gilliman, presented the chapter with a moment of characteristic self-conflict. The Magi Calculi, the Adeptus Mechanicus analytical specialists attached to the Iron Council to assess strategic situations and calculate probability of success, reviewed the proposal to join the crusade and returned an unfavourable assessment. The numbers didn't justify the commitment. The risk-reward calculation, by their models, pointed toward remaining in the Medusan Reach and protecting what they had. Stronos overruled them. He committed the chapter anyway. This is worth pausing on because it's one of the most quietly significant moments in modern Iron Hands history. The most powerful leader the chapter has had in 10,000 years, a man who has spent centuries arguing that cold calculation should guide decisions rather than emotion, looked at a cold calculation that said stay home and made a judgment that the situation required something the numbers couldn't capture. He went anyway because it was right, because the Imperium needed it, because whatever calculation models you build, there are still moments where being a warrior in the service of something larger than yourself means accepting costs that no spreadsheet will recommend. His successor chapters and brothers in the 10th Legion's lineage would understand what he was doing, even if they didn't say so in those terms. The Primaris Space Marines that arrived with the Crusade were, predictably, received more warmly by the Iron Hands than by most chapters. New genetic templates, improved physical baselines, better starting material for the augmentation programs that define what Iron Hands warriors become over the course of their service lives. The chapter integrated its Primaris reinforcements with the brisk, practical efficiency of beings who view everything through the lens of function. How well does it work? How much can it be improved? What does it replace? And is the replacement better than what it replaced? The ongoing threats of the era Indomitus, a chaos raid directly on Medusa by the combined forces of the Cleaved, the Purge, and Typhus's forces, sustained campaigns across the Stygia sector, as the ongoing complexity of the war for Vigilus and the strategic picture it represents. All of these continue to demand everything that the Iron Hands can provide. In their surgical bays, augmentations continue. In their council chambers, ancient dreadnoughts contribute voices that carry the authority of ages to deliberations that will shape the chapter's next campaign. On Medusa's surface, the land behemoths crawl their eternal patrol under volcanic skies, watching the clans for the next generation of warriors worthy of iron and the philosophy that iron represents. Part 12. What the Iron Hands are really about. The deeper story beneath the steel stepped back from the campaigns and the organization charts and the augmentation rituals. Look at what the Iron Hands are saying at the structural level about the human condition, because this is what makes them genuinely interesting in ways that go beyond cool, visual aesthetic or effective tabletop rules. And it's why their story rewards the kind of slow, careful attention this kind of content invites. They are a story about trauma that never got processed. Istvan V was catastrophic. The loss of Ferrus Manus, the absolute destruction of almost their entire legion, the beheading of their Primarch by the being he had loved most, in full view of whatever survivors could see it, was the kind of wound that doesn't heal in any conventional sense. It leaves a scar that changes the shape of everything around it. And what the Iron Hands did with that wound was reach for the only tool they understood, engineering. As they took the wound apart, analysed it, identified what they believed were its structural causes, and built a doctrine to prevent those causes from ever having purchase on them again. They built the tempering, they built the philosophy of iron over flesh, they built an entire civilization of the self designed to prevent a specific kind of suffering from ever touching them again. What they didn't do was grieve. What they didn't do was sit with the loss and let it be what it was. Devastating, irreversible, the kind of sadness that changes you before deciding what to build in the aftermath. They went straight to building, to correcting, to the work of prevention, and the thing they were preventing, the grief, the attachment, yet the particular vulnerability of caring deeply about something that can be taken away, never got to complete its natural process. This is a recognizable human pattern. The person who buries a loss under productivity, who converts suffering into work because the work at least gives them something to control, who builds walls so successfully that they lose track of what the walls were protecting and begin to believe the walls are the point. The Iron Hands did this at scale, across an entire culture, and then spent 10,000 years reinforcing the walls, because the walls were the identity. The Gardenian heresy happened because something reached through those walls and touched what they'd buried there, and it almost destroyed them. They are also a story about the limits of self-improvement as a response to loss. The Iron Hands believe, in the most literal sense available to them, that they can make themselves better than they were, that the flesh can be replaced by something superior, that what makes them vulnerable can be surgically addressed. And they're not entirely wrong. The augmented warriors of the Iron Hands are, in many objective measures, superior to unaugmented space marines in specific categories of performance. The philosophy produces genuinely effective warriors. The problem is not that it's wrong. The problem is that it's incomplete, that the thing you can't replace, the core of consciousness that animates the machine, carries with it something that cannot be optimized away without also optimizing away the reasons for continuing to fight at all. The dreadnoughts are the most honest expression of this problem. These ancient warriors have given everything to the machine. They have become, as completely as it's possible to become, what the Iron Hands believe they're all supposed to be working toward. And they are extraordinary, powerful, experienced, possessed of tactical knowledge accumulated over centuries that no living warrior can match. But are they happy? Are they fulfilled? Are they, in whatever sense can meaningfully be applied to beings in their condition, at peace with what they've become? The script that the chapter's philosophy provides doesn't include those questions. It was written by people who decided to stop asking them. But those who have spent real time with the Iron Hands canon will recognize that this silence is not comfortable. The ancient dreadnoughts are treated with reverence, yes, and that reverence is genuine. Should the Iron Hands genuinely believe that their entombed warriors have achieved the nearest available approximation to the state the philosophy is aiming at? But the behavior of those warriors, the long silences, the periods of withdrawal that the chapter attributes to meditative contemplation, but that look from the outside more like catatonic absence, the moments in council chambers when an ancient machine spirit that once commanded legions sits completely motionless for hours at a time while the living argue around it. These are details that the philosophy's promotional materials would not include if it were preparing a brochure. There is also the question of what happens when a dreadnought reaches the point where the biological material that houses its consciousness is no longer capable of maintaining that consciousness. Most ancient dreadnoughts, after sufficient centuries, enter a state of final stasis from which they do not emerge. This is understood within the chapter as the last and greatest rest, the achievement, finally, of the total stillness that the warrior has been working toward for their entire existence. Whether it is, in fact, rest, or simply the point at which there is no longer enough biological substrate to sustain the consciousness, is a question the chapter's philosophy does not encourage examining. To ask it would be to suggest that what they have honored as the highest achievement of the tempering might, at its terminal stage, be indistinguishable from death. The specific kind of death, slow, quiet, piecemeal, that the program was supposedly preserving warriors from. They are also a story about the relationship between philosophy and identity. The Iron Hands built their doctrine to explain and justify and prevent a specific catastrophe. But doctrines, once established, take on their own momentum. They outlive their immediate purpose. They become self-justifying. The Iron Hands have been practicing the tempering for so long and reinforcing it so thoroughly that questioning it is difficult in the way that questioning the foundations of a building you've been living in for 10,000 years is difficult. The building is all you know. The building is you. Cardan Stronos asking his chapter to master their emotions rather than eliminate them is, in this context, a genuinely heroic act. He's not offering a comfortable revision. He's asking them to excavate the foundations and find out what's down there. Was to look at the thing they sealed away in 006.M31 and acknowledge that it's still there and still matters. To do the hardest version of the work that doesn't involve augmentation or calculation or tactical doctrine, the work of sitting with what they lost and being honest about what it cost them. The Iron Hands are still in the middle of this work. 10,000 years after the day that defined them, they are still, in the most meaningful sense, survivors of Istvan Fife, trying to figure out what surviving means. Whether the machine they've built around their grief is protecting them or trapping them. Whether the walls they've constructed are keeping the darkness out or keeping the light in. These are not questions with clean mechanical solutions. They cannot be solved with another augmentation. What they require the thing the Iron Hands are least comfortable with. Honest engagement with the soft, warm, breakable, weeping core of what they actually are. The flesh is weak. Yes, maybe. But the question of what the flesh is for, what it contains, what it carries that the machine cannot replicate, that's one that the Iron Hands have been answering incorrectly for 10 millennia. and the cost of that incorrect answer is written across the chapter's history in every moment where their own philosophy was turned against them. The most powerful statement about what it means to be human in all of Warhammer 40K's vast and grim dark library might be this one: a chapter of warriors who have spent 10,000 years trying to stop being human, and who keep finding that the human thing they're trying to stop being is the part that matters most. So, closing thoughts. The Iron Hands are not the easiest chapter to spend time with. They don't radiate warmth. They won't offer you inspiring speeches or noble sacrifices or the particular glow of warriors who genuinely love what they do. They're not the Blood Angels, luminous and tragic, fighting the darkness inside themselves with visible passion. They're not the Space Wolves, boisterous and loyal, making the grim business of endless war feel like something that includes comradeship and song. They're not even the Ultramarines, with their competent reliability and their confidence that the Codex Astartes contains the answer to every problem if you're willing to read the relevant section. The Iron Hands are difficult, cold in the way that metal is cold, hard in the way that old scar tissue is hard. Not the natural hardness of health, but the hardness of something that has healed incorrectly and built its strength around the shape of an old wound. They make choices that are hard to admire. They have built a culture that would genuinely horrify many of the people it claims to protect. They look at a grieving comrade and see an inefficiency. They look at an emotional attachment and see a tactical liability. They look at their own flesh and see a problem to be corrected, one surgery at a time, until the original is difficult to find beneath the accumulated metal. But there is something else the Iron Hands offer that most chapters cannot. They are a chapter that is genuinely engaged, even if reluctantly, in the process of changing. The 300 years of Cardan Stronos and his quiet insistence that mastery is not suppression, that the tempering was built to protect something rather than to replace it, that the human being at the center of all this machinery matters. That's 300 years of a chapter having an argument with itself about who it is and who it wants to be. Most chapters resolved these questions in the 1st century after the heresy and have been operating on the conclusions ever since. The Iron Hands never fully resolved theirs because the original question was too big and the answer they reached in its immediate aftermath was too incomplete. And that incompleteness, that ongoing unfinished process, is what makes them one of the most human chapters in the entire setting, in precisely the way that seems most paradoxical. But they are the chapter most dedicated to ceasing to be human that has the hardest time actually accomplishing it. Because what they're made of, the stubborn insistence on endurance, the absolute refusal to accept that the current condition is the final condition, the certainty that whatever you are can be made into something better with sufficient work, is the most human thing there is. And yet, there is something in them that is unmistakably, specifically human. The specific form their grief took, the way they converted the worst day of their existence into a doctrine and then spent 10,000 years living inside it. The way the loss of Ferrus Manus shaped everything, their governance, their philosophy, their culture, their particular hatred for the Emperor's children, in ways they acknowledge but do not fully understand. Whilst that's recognizable, that's the shape that unprocessed grief takes in people, the behavior patterns built around an absence that was never properly acknowledged, the wall constructed against a pain that never completed its process and therefore never stopped. Cardan Stronos, 300 years into leading them, is trying to tell them something they don't quite know how to hear yet, that the machine is magnificent, but that the machine alone is not enough, that the humanity they've been trying to excise is not just a vulnerability, but a necessity, that you cannot protect people by becoming something that has forgotten why they matter. 300 years of the same message, and the Iron Council keeps re-electing him to deliver it, which might be the most quietly hopeful detail in all of Warhammer 40,000. Just there is also something to be said about the chapter's successor chapters, and what they reveal about the range of expression within the Iron Hands ideological family. The Red Talons are, by many accounts, the most extreme distillation of the tempering's harshest conclusions. They have taken the Iron Hand's philosophy and followed it toward a conclusion that even the founding chapter finds difficult to look at directly. Their practice of reconditioning, a process by which battle brothers who display what the Red Talons consider unacceptable levels of emotional response are subjected to intensive psychological modification until the offending responses are eliminated, is regarded by the Iron Hands themselves with something that, in more expressive beings, would be called discomfort.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.